Good afternoon and welcome to episode 110 of the Political Mike podcast. Let's rewind the clock to a pivotal moment in American history. On September 15th, 1963, a devastating terrorist attack shook the nation's conscience. A bomb deliberately planted at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama exploded, causing destruction and tragic loss. This place of worship held great significance as a meeting ground for civil rights organizers, making it a target for those who opposed progress and equality. The attack resulted in the injuries of at least 20 people and claimed the lives of 4 innocent young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. It wasn't until years later, in 2002, when the U.S. government finally declassified critical files, that the pursuit of justice began to unfold. Enter Doug Jones, who had been appointed as a U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama by President Bill Clinton. The U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, Mr. Jones, took up the mantle to prosecute this unspeakable crime. His determination and unwavering commitment played a pivotal role in seeking justice for the victims and their families. But the fight for justice and equality did not end there. Fast forward to today, and we find ourselves grappling with the complex intersection of law, politics, and social progress. Recently, the Supreme Court handed down a significant ruling, with Chief Justice Roberts writing for the majority in a 5-4 decision, reaffirming the Voting Rights Act's authority. This ruling underscored the Act's crucial role in combating racially biased maps and court tests that support it. And so many on the side of progress and expansion of voting rights seem to celebrate, but up to a point. The Supreme Court session has been filled with groundbreaking decisions that would leave far-reaching implications, most recently, the striking down of affirmative action in college admissions, to siding with religious freedom against anti-discrimination laws involving gay rights, and even overturning President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. These rulings have sparked passionate debates and protests and raised important questions about the future of our nation as the United States prepares to celebrate its 247th Independence Day tomorrow. Today, we have the privilege of delving into these topics and more with former Senator Doug Jones of Alabama. Senator Jones, a Democrat, achieved an extraordinary feat by becoming the first member of his party to be elected in the deeply conservative state of Alabama in a quarter century. But his impact goes beyond electoral victories, as he has dedicated his career to upholding justice and championing civil rights. It's an honor to have you, Senator Jones, as we're on the cusp of yet another Independence Day.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Senator Jones, in the title of your book, Bending Towards Justice, it suggests a hopeful tone. What does this phrase, bending towards justice, mean to you? And how do you think it relates to the story you tell in your book?
You know, I think it was a term that Dr. King used consciously to really talk about this arc of the universe and how it bends toward justice, but it doesn't bend by itself. Justice is not something that is automatic. It is not something that we just can take for granted. It is something to be achieved. And I think we constantly need to be striving, and that those that work toward justice are in every day, just trying to bend that arc a little bit more toward justice. So to me, the whole title is, we saw an injustice in this country, not just with the bombing, but with the entire Jim Crow era. And there are so many people that did their part to bend that arc toward justice. I like to think that we played a role in that, but the work is still ongoing. The arc is ever bending, because justice can never fully be achieved for everyone in society. So we got to constantly work at it.
The pursuit of justice is a central theme in your book, of course. So, what are some of the challenges that you faced in bringing the perpetrators of the church bombing to trial, and how did this process shape the broader fight, in your view, for justice in the civil rights era?
For us, the challenges were time. I mean, I became the United States Attorney in 1997. People often forget that the first of these cases was actually prosecuted and tried in 1977 when Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley prosecuted a guy named Robert Chambliss, known as Dynamite Bob. And I was a second-year law student at the time and cut classes and went and watched that trial to just see the drama, to see good lawyering take place before me, never dreaming that 24 years later I'd be in the same courtroom where I watched from the balcony as a kid, trying the same case, essentially, different defendant, but the same case. And I think it's important that we remember those cases. We remember the atrocities. We remember what happened in a Jim Crow era, because if we don't remember those, these things are starting to repeat themselves. You used an interesting term, Mike, when you were introducing this. You said that the bombing shook the conscience of America. Well, for 20-something years after prosecuting these cases, I have used the term that it woke the conscience of America. That shook. And now woke is somehow seen as some politically toxic term. But the fact of the matter is, so many people's conscience in this country was just asleep at the switch when it came to Jim Crow and the atrocities of Jim Crow. We've been asleep at the switch of what's been going on for years now, not just with the Black community, but with other minorities. And I said the same thing after the George Floyd death. And so I think we've got to recognize that people sometimes get lulled into a sense of security, that things are so much better, and they are, that we've achieved some goal, but we have not. I think that recent Supreme Court cases, but more importantly, media and the rise of the right, really the white nationalism and that sort of thing, shows that we still got a hell of a lot of work to do.
Your election was very interesting for many reasons. I was, of course, just graduated from college at the time, about to enter law school, and Sharoni A. Green, a professor of history at the University of Alabama, said that her victory was particularly significant in 2017, given the state's racial politics. Of course, you're a man who made your name prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan, and you defeated an opponent in Roy Moore, who, when asked when America was last great, replied, "I think it was great at the time when families were united, even though we had slavery."
Right.
Those comments made me think about your successor, Tommy Tuberville, the current senator of Alabama. In an interview with a public radio station in Birmingham, Tuberville, who's a member of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, was asked whether he believed white nationalists should be able to serve in the military. Of course, 1 in 5 rioters who attacked the Capitol on January 6th were members of the military. Tuberville said they call them that, referring to the Biden administration's criticism of the white nationalists. He said, "I call them Americans." What are your thoughts about his comments? It seemed as if, every time we make some strides towards justice and the pursuit of civil rights, it's always followed by a doubling down of a return to an ugly past. And I couldn't see that portrayal more clear than in, the election of 2020, the Senate election, in which Tommy Tuberville ended up taking your seat. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's really sad. I think that in this day and age, you've got anyone, much less a United States senator, from Alabama with the sordid history that we have on civil rights, making those kind of comments. And it wasn't his first comments. I mean, this was a guy when he was running for the U.S. Senate, he didn't even know what the Voting Rights Act was. He was asked a question about reauthorizing it, and he had no clue. I mean, I've got a recording of this, that he just literally had no idea what the Voting Rights Act is. When campaigning for Adam Laxalt, the Republican nominee for the Senate, he made similar racist type comments. So this is nothing new, but it is a sad state of affairs. And it shows, I think, in part that so much of our politics today is tribal and partisan, and people simply vote and they will tune out. And this goes Republican and Democrat. Okay, people just simply tune out the views of anyone else. All they ask, the first question is, are you Republican or Democrat? And that defines you as a person. They don't ask the important question. And the important question is, what's your purpose? What do you stand for? What do you stand for? Not what does somebody on another part of the country stand for? And get people talking. The fact is that when Tommy Tuberville was running for office in Alabama in 20, he hid. They kept him quiet. He didn't debate. He refused to get on a debate stage. He hid behind TV commercials and scripts. And so people really didn't know who he was. They just knew the name and he was a football coach. But look, he got elected. He got elected fair and square. I didn't claim any fraud or any crazy stuff like that. So Alabama's got a good bit of work to do. I think the country has got a good bit of work to do on race and protecting minorities, because our country is becoming ever more diverse every day. Every day we're becoming a more diverse country. And people have to, I think, understand and embrace that and celebrate that and really make this country the kind of country that I think it's always destined to have been. And that is a multi-ethnic, multiracial country that is still the greatest country in the world.
How does your experience in politics as a former U.S. Senator influence your perspective on civil rights issues?
Well, that's a difficult question, because I've had, I think my experience in public service goes back to my days with the late Senator Howell Heflin, who was one of my political mentors. I was on his first staff in the United States Senate. Howell Heflin was elected to the Senate in 1978. He was one of the first politicians in Alabama, white politicians, who really reached out and represented the African American community and made a point. He was the first to select or have President Carter select our first two African American federal judges, which, by the way, we didn't see additional black federal judges until Barack Obama. And that was not an addition. It was replacing one that just retired. So Heflin taught me an awful lot about civil rights, about equal justice, about what the law means and how it can be used for good, and how public service can be used for good. Then, of course, as United States Attorney prosecuting those cases, you really develop a deep sense of history and a deep sense of social and justice and civil rights and human rights. And so that kind of formed a lot of what I did in the Senate. It formed how I ran for the United States Senate, which was really an unabashed advocate for the minority communities in Alabama who had not had a voice in the United States Senate since Senator Heflin had left. It's why I became a champion of HBCUs and helped get permanent funding and increased funding. It's why I became a champion of black farmers who couldn't get federal loans and federal ID numbers because they were heirs property owners and they didn't have good title to their property. It's why we did so many things on maternal health and that sort of stuff. So a lot of what happened with me got formed, I think, in my legal career. And then, of course, being in the United States Senate and having that ability to do some things, even the Civil Rights Cold Case Act, which is opening up civil rights files from decades ago so that families and communities can see things. All of that is a building block, Mike. I mean, it's part of a platform that is built slowly over the course of your life. And I think that it was accelerated some when I was in the Senate, because you get a much broader perspective, I think, of both the justices and injustices in the world.
So, Senator Jones, as you know, the Supreme Court on Thursday, June 29th, issued a major decision addressing two cases that challenged affirmative action in higher education. One of the cases was Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus President and Fellows of Harvard College. The other case was Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus University of North Carolina. The court, in a 6-3 decision, held that race-based affirmative action in higher education violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title VI. What are your thoughts about this decision? And do you think that Title VI offers any recourse moving forward, to combat some of the legal challenges that conservative action groups are going to start launching as we're heading into a post uh, affirmative action America?
Yeah, I was disappointed in the decision. I really believed that the dissent that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote is really the appropriate response to affirmative action. That our Constitution, that our society is not completely colorblind. It never will be completely colorblind. And we've got centuries, we've got a couple of centuries worth of not just slavery, but Jim Crow and other laws that went back, for decades and centuries, that held people back. And you just can't overnight overcome that. At the same time, as disappointed as I think people are with those cases, I think that there are other ways to address diversity in higher education. I think the Biden administration will be looking very hard at various ways that Congress has passed legislation to address the issues. I think colleges and universities are going to they understand and know the significance of diversity in their institutions, in their faculty, as well as their student body. And I think they're going to make the efforts, looking however they can, to make sure they get a diverse and inclusive student body. That is going to take some interesting work on the part of these universities at this point. It will take more legal challenges to come forward. But I think that the door was cracked. Mike, I've said before in a number of speeches that I refer back to George Wallace's stand when he tried at the University of Alabama in 1963. And what I tell people is that, in Alabama, we often, we celebrate, like too many other states, I think, we celebrate obstructionists like George Wallace, those that were on the wrong side of history. And we should just do away with this term about the stand in the schoolhouse door, because it somehow celebrates Wallace's, defiance. We should really celebrate Vivian Malone and James Hood, who walked through the schoolhouse door. That's what we should be thinking of. And the fact is that I think the Supreme Court closed that door, not completely, but it was closed. But what people forget is the door to the schoolhouse in colleges has always been heavy. And even though it may have been open somewhat, opening it wide enough for everybody has been a difficult process. And now it's been closed somewhat. And I think we've got to all work to make sure that higher education doors are open to all that have an opportunity. But we also need to go back to our public education and making sure people are prepared to walk through those doors and to succeed.
And of course, there was another major decision issued the next day, Friday. This was the last day of the Supreme Court's year-long term, and the Supreme Court struck down President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. The court concluded in a 6-3 ruling that the president overstepped his executive authority by making such a large-scale change to the program via a waiver as laid out in the 2003 HEROES Act, which was signed into law by President George W. Bush. Chief Justice Roberts was joined by 5 other Republican appointees to the court, and he said the 2003 law provides no authorization for the secretary's plan, even when examined. And I wanted to get your thoughts about this, because he said that even when you're looking at the ordinary tools of statutory interpretation, let alone clear congressional authorization, the president overstepped his bounds as commander-in-chief. What are your thoughts about that criticism and the Supreme Court's ruling, and also the criticism from young people who say that the president should have done more, or should have moved faster or sooner? Your thoughts, sir?
Well, there's a lot of things. First of all, I think that criticism pointed toward the president of the United States is totally unfounded. It is, I understand the frustration for sure, but I think we need to direct that frustration where it needs to be directed. And the President of the United States does have limited tools in the toolbox. There are too many people out there that are just simply think that he can wave a magic wand under certain statutes and all of a sudden all of this debt will be forgiven. That is just simply not the case. And the president has, I know for a fact, has looked at this very, very hard. He has had teams of lawyers in both the White House as well as the Department of Education looking at this. His proposal was not a sweeping change and wholesale elimination, but a fairly modest way using the HEROES Act. I think the Supreme Court, I agree with the president that they just did not interpret the Constitution. This was a political outcome and not one that was driven by the Constitution. I think in that administrative law, and I am not an expert, Mike, okay? I hadn't practiced now for a few years, so let me just give everybody that qualification. But the fact is that the president is going to be going back to the well, and they're going to be looking at again. You know, historically, you've got to try something, and you got to try what you believe to be the best opportunity to succeed with something. The president did that. The fact that he didn't succeed is because there were 6 people on the Supreme Court, 3 of whom got nominated by Donald Trump in a 4-year period, when if Hillary Clinton had been the president of the United States, we would not be in this problem. But there's also an element of getting people at the grassroots level to not just simply talk and point fingers at the president of the United States, but go to their members of Congress, go to their their senators, especially senators in these red states, these Republican senators. Go to the members of Congress in their district, and these Republican members, and say, by God, do something. This is out of control. And you may not, that may result, Mike, in something less than wiping out all of the debt. And quite frankly, I would be fine with that. I'm not one who believes that every dollar should necessarily be written off because people have to take some responsibilities. On the other hand, if you look, this is a really complicated issue. And so much of that debt is accrued interest that was accruing at exorbitant rates during a time in which interest rates in this country were very, very low. That is just unfair. That should have never been. And so if you could do something, for instance, and I haven't got proposed a bill on this or anything, but if you could do something about the interest rate and compromise the accrued interest, it would knock out so much of the debt. You do have to do something to make sure that there is some income base. I don't think it's fair for a doctor to necessarily have all his debt wiped out when the poor person who had to drop out of college to take care of his family is in the same boat. There's got to be some equities here because people did use those loans and they're making great money. So it's really a very complicated issue. And I think that the criticism directed to the president of the United States, who has limited abilities to do something, is really unfair to him.
So what do you think about what President Biden has agreed to do? You know, under the alternative strategy, President Biden announced that his administration will invoke the 1965 Higher Education Act to allow Secretary Cardona to compromise, waive, or release loans under certain circumstances. In the meantime, President Biden said that they also have a plan to help alleviate the financial stress as loan payments restart in October after a 3-year pause. The administration to create a temporary 12-month on-ramp repayment program, which would remove the threat of default for borrowers who are unable to pay their bills. The Department of Education will not refer borrowers who miss payments to credit agencies for a year as they are readjusting to make payments again. The president also noted other work by his administration to provide relief, including modifications to the income-driven repayment plan to cut down the amount that borrowers have to make on their monthly payments by half, from 10% of their discretionary income to 5%. President Biden said that this change will save the average borrower $1,000 a year. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's adequate, or do you think that the president should do even more?
Well, I think he's doing as much as he possibly can. Again, he cannot wave a damn magic wand, and that's what people want. People want him to just say, "Oh, we're just going to get rid of $2 trillion worth of debt." You cannot do that. You cannot do that, folks. And I don't care what anybody says. I don't care even what some of my former colleagues in the Senate say. We looked at this issue a lot. You just simply can't do it. What I think the president did is I think he came up with a very modest proposal initially. And he wanted it had to be tested. We know it was going to get tested in court. Everything that you just rattled off is also going to get tested in court. But now we've got a better idea of what the court thinks about this so that we can tailor that relief around this court's ruling. And there is incredible value to that. And the other thing about this is that as this starts to get rolled out, people need to remember that everything that you just said that this president is going to be trying to do over the next year and a half, and hopefully beyond, can be completely undone with the stroke of a pen if someone like Donald Trump or any one of the Republican nominees, people that are running out there, get elected. Every one of them on day one will stop exactly what you're trying to do. People need to remember that as well when they're criticizing the President of the United States. The alternative is someone who is going to halt it in the tracks and punish people if they don't make these payments rather than working with people. So there is an electoral element. And again, Mike, I understand the frustrations. I really do. I worked hard with my 3 kids to get them at a very, very, very minimum. One of them has a little bit of student debt. The other 2 did not. So I understand the frustration with so many people out there, but they need to make sure to be smart and work with their, and really let this Congress is the only body that could fix this with one vote. They could fix this because Joe Biden would sign it. But so we've got to get Republican members in the House and the Senate on board with doing something. And by the way, this is not just a student debt problem. This is a cost of higher education problem as well. And if we don't fix both of those, we're going to be in the same boat in 10, 15 years. We got to fix both. We got to get these colleges and universities to start using some of their endowments to do other things to try to lower the cost of higher education for their students.
Do you think President Biden's approval rating sitting at the low 40s is attributable to an inability to successfully sell the legislative victories he has had and the executive actions he has taken since taking office?
No, I don't think it's his inability to sell. I just don't think that as president, he has been a campaigner. I think as president of the United States, he has actively tried to be the president of the United States and get things done. And his accomplishments are remarkable. The infrastructure bill, you name it. We could spend days talking about this. But I think there is a big difference. Unlike others, unlike, for instance, Donald Trump, who literally was holding campaign rallies 2 months after he got into office. Joe Biden had to bring us out of COVID, who had to help stabilize this economy, who had to deal with supply shortages, supply chain shortages, who had to deal with rising inflation. He has been working as the president of the United States, not as the campaigner in chief. That is beginning to shift. And I think as that shift takes place more and more, he will still have to be the president. That's his job, and he is going to be first and foremost. But I think as the campaign gets really geared up, you will see more messaging, more things going out there, more independent expenditures from people that are supporting him, more surrogates out there. And that's when the rubber really meets the road. I think in the next year, especially after the infrastructure projects start going, the chips and these manufacturers start building these facilities that are coming in, and people and inflation still continue to come down and raise wages continuing to rise as inflation comes down. I think people are going to see the benefits of that. It's going to be a lot easier with that message, and we go from there. But I think the main issue right now is he is focused on being president of the United States and getting things done, not the chief campaigner, because he was elected to be the president, not as a candidate.
Senator Jones, when President Biden was elected, I predicted that you were going to be Attorney General. To all the friends who would listen to me, I really did think you were going to be the Attorney General. But of course, Merrick Garland's the Attorney General, and there are many who have criticized, his leadership in the Justice Department, especially in light of the federal indictment that Trump has received as a result of keeping classified documents. After, of course, a number of requests from the National Archives to return those documents. And of course, he denied those requests. Some argue that pursuing charges against the former president sets a dangerous precedent and could be seen as politically motivated. How do you respond to these concerns? And what factors do you think should be taken into account when considering legal action against a former president? And if you could also talk about the criticism that the current Attorney General has received for seemingly being too tepid or too mild and slow moving as it pertains to the swirling federal charges surrounding the former president.
Well, I want to address that latter part first. It's interesting that on the one hand, you have Democrats, and that's who's criticizing Merrick Garland, okay? Democrats and those on the left saying he's been too timid, too tepid, he should have moved quicker, whatever. And on the right, they're talking about impeaching him because he's weaponized. So if it's kind of like a legal mediation, Mike. You go in and you got one side saying this and you got the other side saying that, and you come out and you come somewhere here and nobody's really satisfied. So it means the mediators must have done a pretty damn good job. Well, if you got the right criticizing you, you got the left criticizing you, you're playing it straight by the law. And that's what Merrick Garland's doing. And I think it's unfair on both sides, but I am more concerned about the criticism he has taken from the right about weaponizing the Department of Justice. That is the farthest thing that he is. It is just laughable that people are making those arguments. He is as straight a era as has ever been in that seat in the Department of Justice. He has not been political at all. He has appointed appropriately so independent counsels. He is not making these decisions. Jack Smith is making those now. And so I do not think that this has been weaponized at all. There is nothing to suggest, given the facts. Now, the bigger question is about indicting a former president. And as I have said many, many times since leaving office and even before, this is not a decision to be taken lightly. Having said that, I've done a lot of prosecutions. I've represented a lot of political figures in my day. I've never seen a single political figure who has not screamed politics about their investigation. Some were found not guilty, which, by the way, doesn't mean they were innocent. It just means that the government didn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And some were found guilty and went to prison, all proclaiming their innocence, but all proclaiming that it was a political witch hunt. And so this is nothing new to talk about politics. Whenever you have a political figure that gets under investigation and then under indictment, he or she and their supporters are going to claim that it's politically motivated. The question is going to be the facts and the law, not whether or not there is some weird political motivation, which I do not in any way think is the case involving Donald Trump, and particularly with the Department of Justice. But, it is one of those things where they are looking at the facts and the law. And I know, and I've said this many times, that internally within the Department of Justice, they understand the significance of this, the precedent-setting nature of this. But you have to really follow the facts and the law. And then there's got to be this balance. Do the facts and the law justify this risk that you're going to set a precedent that every administration is going to start criminally investigating their political opponents. Donald Trump has already said that's exactly what he is going to do. He is going to investigate his political opponent. He has no basis to say it. He had no basis to say it against Hillary Clinton. And by the way, there was no prosecution of Hillary Clinton, which he promised he would do, because the facts and the law didn't support it. But if the facts and the law support a prosecution, then I don't know how you don't prosecute. The President of the United States does not and should not get a get out of jail free card just because they got elected to office. If they did, we would have had even more corruption than what I think we have seen sometimes in the past, but we certainly would see that going forward. And so I don't know all the facts regarding Donald Trump, and neither does anyone else. Those are going to come out in a court of law. We've seen more facts come out with regard to the indictment, but they're only alleged facts. They're allegations right now. They're not been proven. And Jack Smith and his team are going to have to get in front of 12 men and women from South Florida and prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, a doubt based on reason, one that you would not hesitate to act in the most important of your own affairs. And if they do that, he will be found guilty. If they don't do that, he will be found not guilty. And either way, the system will have worked.
Of the Republican Party who become the more prominent members of the party, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, are taking those positions not from any kind of policy successes or legislative victories, but simply because they're the most vocal as it pertains to throwing red meat to the base. And I say that in light of the fact that recently Lauren Boebert beat Marjorie Taylor Greene to the punch of filing articles of impeachment for the current president, President Joe Biden, over the southern border. I mean, what are your concerns about, Congress moving forward as we're entering a more polarized state and less serious members are taking seats in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we could potentially see a reduction of the sense of reverence that people have for processes like impeachment?
Well, Mike, let's just be very candid about this, okay? This is nothing new, and Democrats have been just as guilty. When Donald Trump was elected, there was immediately people calling for his impeachment based on the Access Hollywood tapes, based on a number of things. In 2016, when people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be elected, there were Republican members of Congress saying that they were going to file impeachment, bills of impeachment on day one. So there are extremes in all parties. And in fact, I do believe that there were some bills of impeachment filed against Donald Trump before the Ukraine call, before the January 6th investigation. People were screaming on the far left for Donald Trump's impeachment. So we've got to be fair. We are in a situation right now where I think that the far right in the House is doing that. But this is a problem that I think is a pox on both houses of Republicans and Democrats. And we need to get past that. We need to let the institutions of government play out without trying to threaten people to fulfill what you think they need to fulfill as opposed to their constitutional duties, whether you like those the way they're doing it or not. And so, yeah, I worry a lot about this. I worry considerably about this. It is why that when I was in the Senate, we spent so much time in my office studying the matter involving the first Donald Trump impeachment. That was not something that I took lightly. It was not. There were people that had made up their mind on both sides of the aisle, one way or another, when that investigation started in the House, much less when it got over. People had already made up their mind. We didn't do that. I took my job seriously. I had a feeling it was coming over based on what I saw, but I didn't know what my vote would ultimately be until toward the end. And I do think people ought to just That's an extraordinary procedure. It's an extraordinary remedy. And people are just now filing these bills of impeachment for political reasons and as political show. And we got way too damn much pure political show in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals around the country. And we need to get back to political work and working together and trying to do things for the American people and not just trying to score political points with your base, whether it's right or left.
You know, we're about to enter our 247th year as a nation. You know, I've watched many elections before 2020, and the one thing that you could hear news anchors and political commentators say, you know, regardless of who was running and who became victorious, was that we're going to have a peaceful transition of power. There was recent news, of course, that the former president contacted the governor of Arizona, Doug Ducey, and that the former vice president, Mike Pence, was also in communications with Doug Ducey, but of course, not in the same kind of vein that the former president was. Of course, Trump was pressuring him, you know, in the same way he pressured Brad Raffensperger in Georgia to help him come up with the necessary votes needed to, you know, overturn the election and change the trajectory of what ultimately happened, the inauguration of President Joe Biden. What are your thoughts about that? And also, if you can shed light on the bigger picture of elections to come moving forward, as we're holding our breath that serious people who could administer their responsibilities and duties would take positions like Secretary of State for, you know, state governments and making sure that they take the governor mansions and things like that, ensuring that people who are not beholden to pressure, partisan pressure like this, take those positions.
Well, you know, look, I think it's a matter of first, we do need to be looking forward, not backwards. That's number one. I'm getting a little tired of listening to what Donald Trump may have done to, quote, pressure somebody. That's quite frankly never rocked my boat as something other than just Donald Trump being shrill and Donald Trump being desperate. And pressuring somebody to commit a crime is one thing, if that happened. And quite frankly, I don't know if that happened with what I'm hearing about Arizona, pressuring somebody to do everything possible to try to make sure that you had some things. And they did some things in Arizona later after this phone call where they sent in people and they found Biden actually won by more votes. So I think we need to be really careful of getting all worked up about a call that a losing candidate may have made to a supporter of his, and Ducey was a supporter of his, to say, you know, what can we do there in Arizona? What can we do to try to find these votes if they exist? What I really worry about more is going forward, and people are taking that as saying that the election may have been stolen, which there's no evidence of. People are believing that. And we've got a problem in this country right now where the elections are at risk in 2024 because there are people in place that are that will both try to suppress votes as well as subvert the elections, that are in a position that can literally, on their own whim, with no evidence whatsoever, try to overturn these elections. I am much more concerned about what's going on in 2024. In fact, Mike, as we were sitting here, I just got there was a headline from Politico about the self-inflicted voting machine misinformation crisis that is looming over 2024. Okay. And so we've got to try to get people on both sides of the aisle to be straight up about this and look at folks and understand that these elections need to be secure. They need to be fair, but we need to be doing all we can to make sure people have the facts. And I think we're in for a rough road, I think, in 2024 with some of these states and some of the way people are looking and the threats, the violence that is being threatened against voting election officials is just stunning. And those are the kind of things that I think we really need to get what I call the pro-democracy coalition, people of both parties and independents alike, saying that we cannot do this. We've got to let the chips fall where they're going to fall and have the peaceful transitions of power. But also, we just got to have these fair elections. So it's a real concern that I've got going forward. I think we need to focus more on what's happening today rather than what happened in 2020.
If Trump doesn't get the Republican nomination in 2024, which Republican 2024 presidential candidate do you think has the best chance to beat the current incumbent President Joe Biden?
Well, I think Joe's going to win anyway. I don't think it matters. And I really mean that. Yes, I am biased. I've known Joe Biden for over 40 years. He's my friend. I've always known he would be a good president. He has not disappointed me in the least. So I think he can win all those. I don't want to handicap this because right now it is a hot mess over there. And I think the big question is whether or not what happens if Donald Trump is not the nominee. I don't see Donald Trump going quietly in the night. I just don't see Donald Trump on stage at a Republican convention holding up the hand in victory with whoever just beat him. That I just don't see that happening. And you got a bunch of folks, this MAGA element of this, who I'm not sure will not split off or do something crazy. What I'm more concerned about, Mike, is not the Republican nominee. What I'm more concerned about are these idiotic third party folks who, for some reason, think that Biden's low poll numbers mean that there's a chance that a third party candidate can come in and have a quote unity ticket or some other Green Party ticket or whatever and somehow win the presidency. That is just a fantasy. It's a total fantasy. There's no way on God's green earth that a third party, even today, can win 270 electoral votes, which means if they take away enough that you've got a Republican nominee, whoever it might be, is going to be the next president by one of two ways. They're either going to win it outright because so many votes will be taken away from the Biden-Harris ticket, or it will be thrown to the House of Representatives. And people don't know how that works. And for those that don't, it's not like everybody gets a vote, in the House and the Senate. Each state gets one vote, and there are more Republicans controlling the House now in state legislatures than there are Democrats. So it means under 2 out of the 3 circumstances, a Republican is elected. So I think that these third party bids are crazy. I think we ought to let folks work within both political parties, pull from the extremes to do things in both political parties to get back to the mainstream for the American people.
Before I let you go, Senator Jones, I just want to pivot a little bit to foreign policy. Of course, the Wagner Group, which many have described as a mercenary group in Russia, their actions in Ukraine have had significant consequences for the region and the conflict itself, the war between Russia and Ukraine. How do you see the recent developments by the Wagner Group impacting the ongoing conflict and potential path towards a resolution?
Yeah, look, I think that remains to be seen at this point. You've got the head of the Wagner Group that is in exile right now, but he ain't done. He is still making a lot of statements. You never know where this is going to go. Clearly, Putin was wounded. It showed some weaknesses, not just within his military, but I think his leadership personally. But where that goes, I don't know. The United States has, I think, appropriately stayed the hell out of that controversy. There was an article I read this morning about how the administration specifically reached out to say, to let the Kremlin know that the United States was not behind this. None of our allies were behind any of this. We're not going to interfere. I think that it really remains to be seen. I'm not trying to avoid your question, but there is so much instability and uncertainty over there right now within Russia, within the region, that I think it's hard to see how this plays out. But I do believe that the Ukrainians will take advantage of this in the sense that their goal is to win this war. Their goal is not to topple Russia and take over Russia. Their goal is for an independent Ukraine to remain independent, to kind of claw back territory that they have lost to Russia. So I think that they have an advantage right now. But you know what? They kind of seem to have an advantage all along, and I think that's in part. And again, I'm gonna blow the toot the horn of the Biden administration. I think they've done an incredible job of bringing our allies around back into a situation where we have a strong strategic alliance. We have a strong democracy alliance. And when democracy is a threat around the world, Joe Biden and the United States of America have led the charge to say, no, we are going to be the backstop to that. And I think the Ukraine is the best example of that. So we will see how the weaknesses will play out, whether or not Putin can recover, and whether or not Ukraine can utilize this weakness to bring some in to the bloodshed over there.
Given your experience in the Senate, how should policymakers and governments respond to the actions of private military companies like the Wagner Group? Are there measures that could be taken to prevent their involvement in conflicts and address potential human rights abuses?
Yeah, well, there are two questions that you got there. The first, and they're different, by the way. They can be connected, but they're also different. The first question involved in military conflict, and you got the United Nations that is concerned about this. This again, the Wagner Group is something that is now on the forefront, but it is not new. These are the things that have been around for a long time, and that in fact have become more so, I think, after the Iraqi war started back in the George W. Bush administration. So I think this is a challenge with these private military groups. Countries around the world, including the United States, are trying to figure this out and monitor them, because at some point, this can be domestic issues. Remember, we had militia groups in this country who were storming the Capitol on January 6th. We've got these white nationalist groups that we were talking about earlier infiltrating the military and local law enforcement. So we have to be very, very careful and look at this with a jaundiced eye. War crimes is a completely different issue. And if these folks are going to engage in military combat, they also need to be held to the same standards. And I think under the definition of a military combatant, under the Hague and whatever, I think you can hold them accountable. And anyone, any group that commits war crimes needs to try to be held accountable. And so I'm hoping that there will be some review and institution of charges, because from what at least the reports are coming out of Ukraine, the Wagner Group has clearly committed war crimes, at least according to those reports. And somebody needs to hold them, the proper authorities need to hold them accountable.
The very last question I have for you, Senator Jones, is what do you say to young people who want structural revolutionary change as opposed to incremental progress and easily get disillusioned with the political process because of that?
Well, they need to learn a little bit about history, I think. I mean, I understand that. When I was young, I thought I'd be governor before I was 30 years old. Well, that just didn't happen. Okay, life intervened, and I get that. Young people want to see this, and they get frustrated. But there's so many people, Mike. There's so many young people in this country that just don't vote either. They expect that this change is going to happen overnight, or some revolution, for whatever the hell that means, and I don't know. But again, this is nothing new. We have seen it with the generation that grew up opposing that were in favor of civil rights. We see it with a generation that grew up opposing the Vietnam War, and then all of a sudden it became a little bit of a lull. But now we're seeing all of the attacks on things that this generation, the younger generation, has grown up with and taken for granted. Things like their LGBTQ plus friends, things like equal opportunities, civil rights, all of those things that they have kind of grown up with are now under threat. And I can understand the concern. But what I would say is that history says that change is always the most lasting change is always going to be somewhat incremental. It is not going to be revolutionary. Revolutionary change doesn't always, it rarely will always last. Sometimes it will, but it's because of adapting once that change is made. And revolutionary change is what happened in 1776. Okay, that's revolutionary change, not what young people today are talking about. We're trying to get better health care for people and more universal for folks. We're trying to get wages up. We're trying to make sure people have basic dignity and human rights. Those are the kind of things that our electoral process is designed to give people, but it takes folks getting involved. It takes people getting involved in civic education, civic engagement at the most local level. Their city councils and their board of educations and their county commissions and their state legislatures. We have more people come out and vote in presidential years than we do for state legislators. And the rubber meets the road in the state, folks. So find these things and get engaged, but understand that change can come and can come quicker than what is expected, but it's not going to change, because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, okay? And for everybody that wants a revolutionary change, there's people that are going to want something different. And I want to remind people, too, that there are people in this country that are concerned. Everybody talks about the fact that people overwhelmingly say we're going in the wrong direction. But when you really drill down on it, people have that answer for different reasons. There are people that want that revolutionary change to help people and do good and those things. Then there are folks that think we're going in the wrong direction because we're too woke and we're moving to socialism. We got to get those folks talking to each other, okay? Because nobody is completely right about that. But people have these fears, and there are fears that whether or not they are based on facts or whatever, they're still there. And people need to be able to talk. We need to start having these discussions among ourselves and talk to people and work with folks to try to get our institutions of government on a track where everybody cannot always be satisfied. But you know what, Mike? I grew up with the Rolling Stones, okay? And the Rolling Stones saying, you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need. And therein, I think, lies an interesting way to approach politics.
Well, on that note, Senator Jones, it's been a privilege and an honor to have you on the platform. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion that we've had. And I'm still, for the record, predicting that if Merrick Garland steps down, that you'll be Attorney General a second Biden term. Thank you so much, sir, for what you brought to the table. And just want to wish you a happy 4th of July. I hope you have a wonderful time with family and friends tomorrow. With that being said, that concludes episode 110 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you so much, Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePollyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.